This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here is your moderator, Tom Campbell.
Welcome to NC Spin. I'm Brad Crone, guest host for our friend Tom Campbell, who's under the weather this week. Tom, we all wish you a speedy recovery. You've heard and read the spin the media and the politicians have put on the issues of the day. To get the correct spin on what's going on here in North Carolina, let me introduce you to our panel of experts. They include former Speaker of the House, Joe Mavretic, Chris Fitzsimon with NC Policy Watch, John Hood with the John Locke Foundation, and lobbyist Peg O'Connell. This week we'll look at breakthroughs for Electricity and Medicaid Reform. But first, we have a budget deal. Let's jump right in. White smoke was seen coming from the legislative building last Wednesday. There appears to be a budget deal, and it was big news, as Speaker of the House Thom Tillis and Senate President Pro Tem Phil Berger both tweeting that they'd reached a compromise budget deal. The budget deal gives our teachers an unprecedented 7% pay raise, taking North Carolina from 46th in the nation to 32nd in the nation for teacher pay. As we went through this process, it was easy to spot who gave more and who took more. Question for all the panelists: who were the winners and who were the losers? We'll start with John.
Well, I think the obvious winner here, if you want to look at the primary debate, the primary news, which was the teacher pay increase, roughly 7% on average for teachers. Actually, the big winners here are early career teachers, teachers who are just starting out or in their first few years of service. They're actually going to get double-digit pay raises out of this budget. Other teachers will, all the teachers will get raises, but some will not be 7%. It'll be lower than that. More generally, I think that the House and the Senate, though it took them a very long time, I think they ultimately came to a conclusion that I think the public will accept and appreciate, and that everybody else will appreciate getting them out of town.
Joe, winners and losers.
Well, I think the governor was the winner clearly in this one. If you look at the proposal that the governor sent over at the beginning of the short session, and the end product of 70-plus days of sessions, I think the governor's original proposal is probably going to be enacted at the 90-95% level. And clearly, he is the guy who came out ahead of this triumvirate between the House, the Senate, and the executive branch.
Peg, winners and losers.
Well, I think, sadly, I think the people of North Carolina are the loser in this, because we have a budget that seems to be structurally unsound and is only going to get unsounder, if that's a word, going forward. If there's a winner, I think it's the aged, blind, and disabled, because they haven't been kicked to the curb like was originally forecast.
Chris?
Well, I certainly think teachers will be better off with a salary increase, although it's actually not the biggest percentage salary increase in history, as a lot of people are touting it. There have been bigger ones a couple times. It might be the biggest in individual amounts, because teachers make more now. I think the losers are still to be determined. It's interesting that we think of losers as people who didn't get hurt. I hope that's not the way we judge our budgets. I think we'll know as the year goes on who the losers are, because I think Peg is on to something. We learned recently the tax cuts last year are going to cost more. I think there'll be budget cuts during the year made by the governor and the administration that haven't been debated yet. We don't know. State agencies will have less money to operate than we think they do, judging by this budget. So it'll be a while before we know who all the losers are.
Joe, as we did a press conference Tuesday, the Speaker and the President Pro Tem announcing the deal, they said there were $900 million in reserves included in the budget. But there was little talk about the staff memo that came out last year saying the tax cuts that were passed were actually $680 million, 43% higher than they projected. Are we looking at a budget deficit next year?
Well, I don't think so when you talk about a deficit in the common way. First of all, remember that budgets are not finite policy documents. Budgets are based on estimates, and I think a $900 million reserve is a reasonable reserve given the scope of the budget. I think that the governor toward the end of this second fiscal year is going to be able to move stuff around. I don't think there's going to be any
John, there's a lot of concern about spending one-time money.
There is some one-time money for teacher assistance in the deal, but let's clarify a couple of matters real quick. There was a staff memo that has to do with a tax model, and the data fed into the tax model proved to be optimistic. That adjustment has already been made. It was made in the spring. It's exactly the same revenue adjustment. So there is no new information that affects revenue estimates for North Carolina. The staff members who put the staff memo together completely are upfront about what it was and what it was not. It was poorly understood by the reporters that covered it, and it created a firestorm of discussion about an issue that never happened. Now, as to the reserves, they may have lots of reserves. They're not adding a whole $900 million, but I think everybody ought to be concerned, because if you look historically, the economic recovery nationally, which is kind of weak, but it is a recovery, it's getting pretty long in the tooth. There might not be too many years until the next recession, and we need to build up our reserves.
Chris, as we look at this budget, university folks happy?
Well, they're happier they didn't get cut more. I mean, I think, and again, it's interesting that that's what we talk about as success. I know that there's Fred Eshelman, a very prominent member of the UNC Board of Governors, resigned recently. One of the things he said in his resignation letter was he was frustrated at the budget cuts at the university system. So we can't continue to call a success not cutting more, and I think that's what we're going to have to start spending more to keep up with other states. Something
we'll be talking about clearly as we move forward. When we come back, we'll be looking at Medicaid reform. This is NC Spin.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
Travel freely across the country. Not so for agriculture guest workers. They're vilified for doing work Americans won't, and they face a mountain of red tape just to get here. Shouldn't American agriculture get the same consideration as baseball? Farm Bureau and Agriculture, we keep North Carolina growing.
Your family physician supports Medicaid reform. That's good for North Carolina patients, providers, and taxpayers.
For over a year, we've worked with the Governor and the General Assembly on a plan for responsible Medicaid reform.
The Senate's proposed Medicaid changes are a departure from this plan. Changes that could lead to a decrease in the number of primary care physicians providing care in communities that need them the most.
The destruction of our state's medical home network, a network that prevents unnecessary hospital and emergency room visits,
and disregards the elderly, the blind, and disabled, and the health care they need. Care we're morally and legally obligated to provide.
Now is not the time to disregard the progress we've made. Now is the time for lawmakers to implement responsible Medicaid reform that protects and improves health care for all North Carolinians.
Visit rnchealthcare.com and tell your lawmaker to support responsible Medicaid reform.
We now return to NC Spin.
Since the beginning of the McCrory administration, we've heard a lot of talk about reforming our $13 billion Medicaid program here in North Carolina. Last week, there was movement in the legislature to cap Medicaid spending. Wake County Representative Nelson Dollar said Medicaid spending will be a top priority. He said there will be a 1% provider cut in Medicaid spending for doctors and hospitals. Question number one to Peg, where are we standing on Medicaid reform in North Carolina?
Well, I think we're kind of standing out in the hall right now. The legislature has put together its budget, and except for a few tweaks, there's really no reform plan enacted or formalized. There's a lot of talking. The two sides, the House and pretty much the governor, are lined up on one side looking at affordable care organizations, some sort of provider-driven organizations. The Senate, clearly in its desire to get some sort of absolute budget forecasting stability, wants to farm all of this out to out-of-state Medicaid managed care organizations. So the people have spent more than a year talking about this, and they've made very little progress. They do say they will come back in the fall after the election, which I think is a little lily-livered, and attempt to sort this all out. But so far, it's a lot of talking and no results.
John, we've heard a lot of talk about Medicaid reform in the state Senate. Senators Heiss and Pate are basically leading the charge, and they really do, like Peg said, want to look at a Medicaid managed care model here in the state of North Carolina. However, the Commonwealth of Kentucky and the state of Illinois have both recently stopped their Medicaid contracts with their HMOs. Where do we stand on managed care here in North Carolina?
Well, there are a number of different models across the states. Most states have managed care for Medicaid. It's the typical state, not the atypical state. But those networks vary widely. And just like any other contracting process, just as we've experienced with technology contracts and private prison contracts, all sorts of things, you have to get the details right, and you have to structure it correctly and administer it correctly. Kentucky did not. Florida, Louisiana, there are some other states that North Carolina leaders who want to pursue this are looking at as better models. I think actually the most likely outcome might be something like this. You might start out with a reform process where you have these accountable care organizations, provider-led networks, becoming risk capable, so they can actually handle financially risk on behalf of patients. And then maybe a couple of years later, you invite other contractors to bid if they would like to. I think maybe that's a compromise that doesn't force providers to take on roles they're not used to and immediately face competition from other networks, but has that as a possible savings in the future.
You know,
Joe?
When Chris was the chief of staff for Speaker Dan Blue, there was a House committee in '93 and '94 that worked on this specific issue. The bill didn't get very far. It was probably 10 years ahead of its time. But the AOC model is really the basis for that bill. It was a hard process, and I think very well done. And I think we're going to see more of that 1983 event come to fruition in 2015.
Chris, where do the patients and the providers end up in all the Medicaid reform debate?
Well, that's a good question, and they were obviously very unhappy with the Senate proposal. They much preferred the Accountable Care Organization plan that Peg talked about that the governor and the House supported. What I find fascinating is that Carol Steckel, who was hired as the first Medicaid director in the McCrory administration, was a proponent, and her and Secretary Vaush went around the state trying to sell what, in effect, the Senate is trying to sell now. Steckel left, went to a managed care company. That has been abandoned. One thing that I think is a part of this whole discussion is legislators in both chambers don't have a lot of confidence in the leadership of the Department of Health and Human Services. That is making this conversation very difficult.
Peg, I keep hearing a lot of discussion that it's really not a 1% cut. It's going to be a 4 or 5% cut. Where can providers expect their reimbursement levels to be?
Well, you know, I mean, that's like saying, where is Medicaid spending? Or I don't think anybody really knows. And, you know, North Carolina's Medicaid plan does pay better than South Carolina. That's what you hear. It's a richer plan. It covers more people. It pays a little bit more. But still, you know, you have providers who are working every day to deliver good care, and the more you take out of the system, the less they're going to be able to do. It's simple math.
John, let's look at the politics of this. Is it smart for the legislature to take on the House of Medicine to do a major shift like manage Medicaid in the state of North Carolina, especially coming into an election cycle?
Well, it is interesting that, as Peg referred to, they seem to be talking about coming back in after the election to work out the details. I think that is partly avoiding controversy, but I think it's also to make it an issue for people to talk about. And it's not at all surprising that providers want to be in charge of Medicaid. They get the money. It's not surprising that some people who pay would not like the providers to both be in charge of managing care and then get the money at the end of the day. So these conflicts are not all that surprising. They are very common in other states. Most states have worked out more or less how to do this. North Carolina needs to figure it out in a North Carolina way and think very clearly about what our long-term goals are.
CCNC is a major model program across the nation for Medicaid patient care. Chris, is that something that we need to look at?
Well, absolutely, and I think it's a big factor in the debate. Representative Dollar, you mentioned, is a strong supporter of CCNC. Senator Richard Burr gave CCNC an award this past year. There's a lot of institutional support. CCNC would not be too happy with the Senate plan that would open it up to for-profit companies. I think that's one of the big fundamental differences between the two plans. The House generally supports CCNC continuing in its present form or close to it. The Senate does not.
Clearly, Medicaid reform is going to be a huge issue, especially if Peg's right and they come back to Raleigh after the election to deal with it. Lower electrical rates are coming to municipal power customers across North Carolina. That and more as we continue NC Spin.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
Hi, I'm Linda Loveland. I want the best for my kids. Feeding them foods they like within my budget is a priority. But what do we really know about these foods? North Carolina farmers and food experts give you a website to find it all. FeedTheDialogueNC.com, a place where moms like you and me can learn more about the foods we eat and the farmers that feed us. Check it out. Add your input and help feed the dialogue. Let's talk food at feedthedialoguenc.com.
The best part about being a member of a Touchstone Energy Cooperative is that it's your Touchstone Energy Cooperative. Learn more about the power of your co-op membership at togetherwesave.com.
North Carolina's Touchstone Energy Cooperatives, looking out for you.
We now return to NC Spin.
Residents in 32 municipalities, especially in the eastern part of our state, have complained that their power rates were higher than those communities in which people buy their power directly from Duke Energy. Electricities have said their higher rates were largely due to major debts they incurred buying an interest in nuclear power plants. This week, Duke Energy announced they are purchasing these interests back for $1.2 billion, which will eliminate nearly 70% of the debt owed by Electricities. Question one to Chris. The Electricities deal will have about 30% of the debt that they initially got in the late 70s, early 80s. They'll continue to own their transmission lines and the utility poles. Does that mean that we'll see lower rates for Electricity customers in comparison to what customers for Duke Energy are paying?
Well, I don't know about that. It's a good question, but we certainly should see significantly lower rates for folks who are now at Electricities. And if you travel around eastern North Carolina, it's unbelievable how high the electric rates are for people who barely have enough to feed their families. It hurts industrial recruitment. It hurts the poverty level in eastern North Carolina. This is one of the biggest issues. People talk about it, but it's such an insolvable problem. I hope this means that we have a 60 to 70% reduction in electric rates for those people, because it's long overdue.
John, a lot of discussion. The city manager in Wilson, Grant Goins, former chairman of Electricities, was talking about that this is a real major step forward for them from a standpoint of economic development and recruiting industry and commerce into the municipalities, especially in the eastern part of the state. It may be a good deal for Electricities. What about the shareholders for Duke Energy and the ratepayers?
Well, essentially what Duke, and I know they're making some convoluted argument, and I don't mean that pejoratively, I just had a hard time following it, that this would actually save money in the long run because of being able to buy fuel costs differently or something. But essentially they are paying a little bit of a premium here for the good PR, the good politics of resolving an issue that has been very difficult for so many years, particularly, as Chris says, in certain rural areas. Cost does affect industrial recruitment. That's something that conservatives have always understood. It's true with electricity and with taxes. Costs matter, as do other things. Now, the issue here is some of these municipalities, in fairness to everybody else, had bought into these plants, had all this debt, and for some number of years they would use their utility revenues for other things, such as keeping their property taxes artificially low and not paying their debt down. And they are sort of getting rewarded for 20 years ago not doing the right thing, but there's probably no alternative at this point.
Joe, hindsight's 2020. I can remember I covered the town of Clayton when Clayton joined Electricities in the late 70s, and was this a good deal for the municipalities and the municipal electrical customers?
It was kind of a bait and switch in those days, and now it's come home to roost. John's right on the issue of using electric bills to bring in some revenue to keep the property taxes down in some of those cities. It will help to have slightly lower electric rates. I guarantee you that Duke has people who are smart enough to figure out a way to write off most of this.
And that this is a good deal for them. They don't make decisions like that.
They don't
lightly.
make decisions that are bad deals for them. It's going to be a good deal for them. And the other thing is that electricity, even at a cheaper rate in eastern North Carolina, is a good deal, but natural gas availability is an even better one.
Yeah. Well, that raises the question as we move forward, what other energy issues are we going to see, in particular for the municipalities that are providing electricity? Will it be more natural gas, Peg?
Well, I guess that sort of takes us into the whole fracking issue. That is a nice thing, but it doesn't just pop out of the ground in the corner of Main and High Street in Farmville and people start running it into their houses. So this is something in the short term that I think will help lower electricity rates, especially in Farmville, which is very important. And then, you know, over time, we have to consider what kind of power generation we're going to have.
There are already underway pipelines to extend natural gas to places that don't have it. There's several different pipelines underway, and so natural gas is going to play a much larger role in industrial, commercial, and of course eventually replacing additional coal-fired power plants.
Yeah, are you seeing that in eastern North Carolina and in western North Carolina?
Well, I don't know about western North Carolina. A little more difficult because of the mountains, but in the coastal plains, clearly there are already at least 3 projects that are involved, and they're going to bring a lot of industry in, because with 4-lane roads, you got to have the stuff that goes under the ground, water and sewer, and natural gas.
The next real big issue facing the rural regions of the state will be internet access and high speed. Okay, coming up, we'll all get taken to school, learning what we don't know. That's next on NC Spin.
NC Spin is brought to you in part by the North Carolina Farm Bureau. The Farm Bureau and Agriculture. We keep North Carolina growing.
Does your North Carolina business or organization have a story to tell? I'm Richard Campbell, and at Carolina Broadcasting and Publishing, we help tell stories that connect you to the people who will respond. We take the time to understand our clients' needs and what makes them unique. We craft their stories through the efficient use of words, images, and videos that resonate with their desired audience. We also know that a good story is incomplete without a call to action. On video, on air, online, and in print, from concept to final production, no one can help tell your story more effectively or affordably than we can. For special introductory offers, visit carolinabroadcasting.com or call 919-832-1416. Again, that's carolinabroadcasting.com. Let us help tell your story today.
Where do you go when you need to know? ANC makes it easy for you to get the information you need to make well-informed public policy decisions. Our members are industry leaders who are ready to share their industry-specific insights with you. Want to hear both sides of the story? ANC members can tell you. Just use the ANC member directory as your guide or call us directly. ANC members have the knowledge, expertise, and perspective you need to create public policies that are good for North Carolina. We are ready for your call.
We now return to NC Spin.
One of the best parts of the show is when we ask our panelists to tell us something we don't know. They get to choose the topic and sound off on it. Question 1 to Joe, tell us something we don't know.
Brad, Jobs for Life is a faith-based program that tries to help people figure out how to get and keep a good job. They've got about 400 successful people who have completed Jobs for Life program across North Carolina. And this week they're going online, jobsforlife.org, and people who are interested in trying to help other people get a job need to visit that website.
Great. Chris, tell us something we don't know.
Well, North Carolina is one of only 2 states in the country that automatically treats 16 and 17-year-olds as adults when they commit any crime. New York is the other one. They're phasing it out. There's been a push from everybody from the John Locke Foundation to the North Carolina Justice Center to change that and get us more in line with the rest of the country. It still allows judges in specific cases of especially violent or heinous crimes to try juveniles as an adults. But the bill that Marilyn Avila sponsored in the State House passed the House. Has been languished in the Senate all session, never came up. I think it's a terrible mistake. And at some point, we need to join the rest of the country and start treating juveniles in the juvenile justice system unless there's extenuating circumstances.
Marilyn Avila's really done yeoman's work for a long period of time on that issue, so really important. John Hood, tell us something we don't know.
Well, this might surprise people when I say this, but last year, 2013, private sector employers in North Carolina shed 750,000 jobs. About a quarter of the entire private workforce, private number of jobs in North Carolina went away. Now, we didn't go into a Great Depression, because another set of private employers added 825,000 new jobs last year. My point is, we look at these net changes, 1,000 here, 10,000 there, 25,000. We need to understand the economy's churning all the time, and hundreds of thousands of jobs go away in North Carolina every year. The key is to replace them with entrepreneurs.
Well, give us your feedback real quick on the economic data that came out on Wednesday showing 4% in our growth economy. Is North Carolina's economy moving too?
It's probably similar to that in North Carolina, but remember the first quarter was down 2%. This is like a rubber band. You stretch it and it snaps back.
Peg O'Connell, tell us something we don't know.
On August 1st, Chief Judge of the Court of Appeals, John Charles Martin, retired after many, many years of service to the judicial community and the legal community of North Carolina. He's a nationally recognized leader, and his leadership and his fairness will be missed.
It's going to really open up a race on the Court of Appeals for sure, too.
Indeed.
And then we've got the Chief Justice getting ready to retire as well. So the governor's going to have a number of appointments up on his desk, clearly.
Yes.
I'm going to tell you something you don't know either. This job is a whole lot tougher than it looks. I certainly promise you that. You heard and seen the spin on the issues of the day. To stay informed all during the week, give us your feedback and to read Tom's weekly column. Visit our website at ncspin.com or catch us on Facebook. We hope you'll join us next week when NC Spin will take on the issues of interest to the people of North Carolina. Until then, stay informed and watch out for the spin.
Join us next week and get the spin on issues facing our state.